learned fluent Japanese, and I passed the JLPT N1 in just 1 year. This is how I did it. When I first started out learning Japanese, I set out to speedrun it. My plan was to pass the highest level of Japanese, the elusive JLPT N1, in just 1 year. Never mind that it says right here that Japanese is one of the hardest languages to study. When I set my mind out to do something, I'll do it. And after 1 year of learning Japanese, I was able to speak like this.
会社員はずっと8時間は働いてないんですよね。
日本語上手ですね。
Good enough to shock Japanese people. But before we get into how I learned Japanese, let me tell you a story of why. You see, ever since I was a kid, I've been fascinated with Japanese culture. Growing up in Taiwan, there were a lot of Japanese influences, from the food to the media, even the trains were very similar to Japan. My family would always try to go to Japan whenever we had a chance, because Japan was one of the closest destinations that we could travel to. It was only a 3-hour flight away. But even then, whenever we got to go, it still felt like there was a disconnect, because we couldn't really communicate with Japanese people. And so from a very early age, I knew one day I really wanted to study Japanese and then be able to take my parents to Japan and speak in Japanese. But I guess I kept putting it off, and it wasn't until my senior year of college when I had the opportunity to visit a friend that was studying abroad in Hokkaido. I didn't really know how good he was at the time, but I remember it just seemed so cool to hear him speak in Japanese. And seeing that he was able to do it gave me the confidence that I would be able to do it as well. Yeah, and that was the catalyst. When I finally got back to the States, I really sat down and decided to study Japanese. But I don't do things half-heartedly, so when I found out that there was a Japanese proficiency exam, I made it a goal from day one to pass the highest level, the JLPT N1, in as little time as possible. My very first approach to studying Japanese was to enroll in Japanese classes. But I was a little skeptical because I did take 4 years of Spanish in high school with basically no language ability. And so even with the classes, I decided to work through this textbook called by myself. And since I could go at my own pace, I was pretty much done with both volumes after 3 months. And I remember looking this up online at the time, but apparently it takes 2 years for the average college curriculum to go through this textbook, which is just insanely slow. But anyway, since I fully studied the basics at the time, I figured I could probably have conversations with Japanese people. Around that time, there was an event at our school called Undokai, where a bunch of Japanese exchange students from different colleges came around for this one event. So I went there with the idea that I could practice some Japanese and meet some Japanese people. But when I spoke to a Japanese person for the very first time, I could not understand anything that they were saying. And I didn't know how to respond either, because all I learned was how to produce this very textbook sort of Japanese, which is completely unlike real conversation. Yeah, so there was pretty much nothing I could say or do except just nod and say "soda ne." Yeah, I didn't really know if what I was doing even worked at all, because after so long of studying Japanese, I had nothing to show for it. I couldn't even understand basic conversation or respond in any way. I remember over the next few weeks, I really thought about whether or not I really wanted to continue studying Japanese, and I almost even gave up Japanese at this point. If you really think about what language really is and how we learn our native languages as babies, we didn't have to sit in a classroom and go through a textbook. We just listened to our environment, and then one day we magically could understand everything that was going on. And so I began to research this idea even more, and that led me to Stephen Krashen, who's this linguist that theorized that we acquire second languages in the same way that we acquire our native languages.
We acquire language in one way and only one way, when we understand messages.
So at this point, I decided to just completely change my study method and just only focus on immersion. I stopped watching YouTube videos that were in English. I only limited myself to watch Netflix shows and movies that were in Japanese. And I was just trying to immerse in Japanese all the time. And it was at this time that I found out about this program called Anki. And then so I would just add every single sentence I didn't know from my immersion into this program and just keep reviewing and learning new words. I remember there's a period of a couple of weeks where I was doing an average of maybe 3 hours a day, which sounds kind of crazy, but at the time, it didn't really feel like hard work at all, because I knew it was getting me closer to my goal of passing the JLPT N1. One day when I went to the Japanese club at our school, there was a group of Japanese exchange students that just arrived to America. And of course, I was trying to overhear what they were saying, see if I could understand their Japanese. And I had the craziest realization. I actually became able to understand what they were saying. I didn't have to translate anything in my head. I could just listen, I could just hear it, and then it immediately became meaning in my head. I remember that moment. It really felt like my hard work paid off, and that kind of paradigm shift I had from that first time that I talked to Japanese people really made me improve a lot. I remember I felt super confident in my ability, especially since some of the other students who had been studying Japanese for multiple semesters couldn't even understand anything that they were saying. So I decided to put it to the test and go up and talk to them. And yeah, it was definitely a humbling experience. I couldn't really keep up with what they were saying, and they even had to switch to English midway through. In this moment, I realized I really had a lot further to go, because even though I got so much better with comprehension, I didn't spend any time on practicing output. So I didn't learn how to speak at all or even follow a conversation in real time. And so I did the next logical thing, which is I decided to study abroad in Japan with a Japanese host family. This was leading up to one of the scariest moments of my entire life. Not only was I going to a brand new country, I was also going to be staying with a Japanese host family who didn't speak English. I had heard of some horror stories of people getting kicked out for not following the Japanese rules or just not getting along with their host families. But I knew this is what I had to do if I wanted to get fluent in Japanese and pass the JLPT N1 in 1 year. And right before I studied abroad, I applied for the tests, which meant I only had 6 months left. So the clock started ticking. So for the next semester, I pretty much just lived and breathed Japanese. Because of how much I was using Anki, I was really good at kanji and vocabulary words. That meant I was placed in the advanced Japanese class, which featured 4 hours of classes every single day. But at this point, I already knew that classroom immersion wouldn't cut it. So I made an active effort outside of class to meet Japanese people. Sometimes I even go up to random people on campus and strike up a conversation. And that even led to me joining the guitar club at the school. Yeah, and then after school, I'd come back and hang out with my host family, eat dinner with them. I was basically immersed in Japanese 100% of the time, and I could never escape speaking Japanese in any situation. I'd say on average, I was probably immersing in Japanese for about 12 hours every single day. It was really hard to not just hang out with all the other study abroad students, but I knew that I wouldn't have this opportunity to be in a Japanese college environment ever again. But I wasn't just getting better, I was getting better exponentially. I became able to talk to Japanese people of all different walks of life, like elderly people, people who were younger than me, teachers, people who worked in different professions. Compared to when I was just immersed in my room, I typically just watched the same YouTubers or the same TV shows, so I was being exposed to a very limited type of Japanese. I mean, at first it was a lonely road, but by the end of my study abroad, I had made a lot of new friends that I still keep in contact with today. And yeah, like thinking back to that time in America when I couldn't talk to those Japanese exchange students, it felt so natural now to pretty much be able to speak Japanese to anyone. But what I learned is like language acquisition is a simple process, but that doesn't mean that it's easy. You really have to put yourself in these uncomfortable situations for your brain to figure the language out. And there's just something so different about studying abroad and interacting with real people versus just immersing in your room and maybe talking to people online, even if you're spending the same amount of hours. By the end of my study abroad, I was convinced that I mastered Japanese. I mean, which of course wasn't true. I still make a lot of mistakes. But I definitely was light years ahead of everyone else in my study abroad group. I remember sometimes it even felt like it was easier speaking Japanese than English because I was just speaking Japanese 90% of the time. But I still didn't lose sight of my goal, which was to pass the JLPT N1. There was just one big problem though. Throughout my time in Japan, I didn't immerse in business Japanese at all. Apparently that was a major part of the test. With only 2 months left to go, I decided to start applying for jobs in Japan, hoping that it would close the final gap. After I came back to America, I started interviewing with Japanese companies. It was pretty daunting though, because every single interview felt like a JLPT N1 practice test, since I had to fill out these application forms and then do these interviews completely in Japanese. And after about a dozen or so of these interviews, I started looking at practice tests. And it seemed like passing the JLPT N1 was possibly within reach for the very first time. And at that point, I only had a couple weeks left. Yeah, so I just decided to double down on studying. I started adding more words than ever to Anki. I started to read more nonfiction books, articles, and newspapers in Japanese, watching more intellectual YouTubers instead of just like vlogs or random YouTube videos. Even though I looked at a practice test before, I didn't really focus on doing any drills because it was really obvious to me that knowing real Japanese would be the key to passing the test. Yeah, but at this time, I was really laser focused in finding out the most efficient study method. And I even started this podcast where I interviewed a lot of high-level Japanese learners about how they got to where they did. But before I knew it, it was time to take the test. Yeah, so I went to my local university and I remember it was super packed on that day. I was amazed that there were that many people studying Japanese as well, because for the most part, studying Japanese has been pretty lonely. Yeah, I've never been a person to be nervous taking exams, but for some reason that day, it was super nerve-wracking walking into the testing center. After all, it had been a test that I've been studying the entire year for. As I walked into the testing center, I realized it was time for me to put it all to the test. Everything I had learned, every Anki card I ever repped, every anime series I ever watched, and every hour that I put in. And when the results came in, I passed. I almost couldn't believe it, but it seemed like all my hard work finally paid off. And yeah, the rest is history. All you need to get fluent in Japanese is persistence, immersion, and at most Anki. And if you want to learn Japanese too, check out my course link. If you do use Anki though, make sure not to repeat my biggest mistake with the app that really stopped me from getting fluent even faster. In this video right here, I explain why using Anki might be hindering your ability and what the true key to fluency is.